The dust settles on the golden savanna as the sun bleeds red across the horizon, and somewhere out there, a young lion is breathing his last breaths. At least, that's what everyone thought. What happens next is one of the most extraordinary stories ever witnessed in the wild. A tale of betrayal, survival, and a comeback so brutal, so complete, that the very brothers who left him to die would one day bow to his rule. But before we get into all of that, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because we cover stories like this every single week, stories that will make your jaw drop and your heart pound straight from the wild. Now let's go back to the beginning. It starts as so many great stories do with a family. On the open plains of East Africa, in a territory that stretched across 30 square kilometers of golden grass and rocky outcrop, there lived a pride. Not a small pride either. This was a dynasty. 17 lions strong with 5 adult females, 3 subadult males, and a coalition of 2 ruling males at the top, brothers themselves, who had held this land for 4 years without serious challenge. They were massive animals, battle-scarred, cunning, and utterly dominant. Their roars at dusk could be heard from 5 kilometers away, rolling across the plains like thunder from a cloudless sky, a sound that froze every living thing that heard it. And then there were the cubs. Born within months of each other, 3 young males came into the world in the same dry season. 2 of them were born to the same mother. One was born just weeks later to a different female. But from the very beginning, these 3 were raised together, tumbling and wrestling and play-fighting in the shade of acacia trees while their mothers watched with half-lidded eyes. If you had seen them as cubs, you would never have guessed that within a few years, this bond would fracture so completely, so violently, that only one of them would survive the fallout. The one we're here to talk about today was the smallest of the 3. Not by a dramatic margin, but enough. Enough for the other 2 to notice. Enough for the dynamic to shift slowly at first and then all at once. Wildlife researchers who documented this pride over the years gave the lion's identification numbers, but for the sake of this story, let's call him by the name the field team eventually gave him. They called him Kapanga. It means blade in Swahili. He earned that name later, much later. In those early days, he was just the small one, the one who got pushed off kills, the one who had to wait while his brothers fed first, the one who learned from a very young age that the world was not going to hand him anything. But here is the thing about early hardship that the savannah understands better than almost anywhere else on Earth. Adversity is not always a sentence. Sometimes, adversity is a classroom. While his brothers roughhoused and spent their early years in easy dominance over each other, Kapanga was learning something different. He was learning patience. He was learning how to read the landscape, how to watch and wait, how to move without being noticed. Because when you are the smallest, when every meal has to be fought for or stolen, you develop a kind of intelligence that comfort simply cannot teach. The field researchers noted it early. While the other 2 males would blunder into situations, Kapanga would hang back, assess, and then act. He was rarely the first to charge, but when he did commit to something, he committed completely. He was even then something different. But the savannah does not care about potential. As the 3 males approached subadulthood, the dynamic within the pride began to change. This is a natural process and a brutal one. As young males grow, the ruling adult males of the pride begin to see them not as offspring to be protected, but as future rivals to be expelled. It is one of the most unsentimental facts of lion society. Your own father or the male who has claimed your mother will drive you out the moment you become a threat, and the window for that expulsion is narrow and violent. For Kapanga and his brothers, that moment came when they were approximately 2.5 years old. The 2 ruling males of the pride had been together for over 6 years at this point. They were still formidable, still capable of defending their territory, but they were aging. There were new scars on top of old scars. One of them walked with a slight but noticeable hitch in his right hind leg from an old buffalo encounter. The other had lost significant sight in his left eye during a territorial skirmish 18 months prior. They were still dangerous, but they were beginning to feel the pressure of time. And when 3 young males in your own pride start filling out, when their manes begin to darken, when their roars begin to deepen, you act. Because in the hierarchy of lion society, hesitation is weakness and weakness is death. The expulsion was swift and savage. It happened at night, which is when lions so often settle these kinds of scores. The 3 young males had been sleeping at the edge of the pride's resting area when the 2 adult males came for them. What followed was short, loud, and definitive. The young males were chased, bitten, swiped at repeatedly, and driven from the territory across a distance of several kilometers until they were well beyond the established boundary. And just like that, 3 young males who had known nothing but the safety of their pride were alone in the world. This is where the real story begins. Because being expelled from a pride is not the end for young male lions, not necessarily. It is the beginning of what researchers call the nomadic phase, a period that can last anywhere from a few months to several years, during which expelled males must survive on their own, build their strength, develop their coalition, and eventually challenge for a territory of their own. For brothers, this phase is usually navigated together. You have each other. You hunt together, rest together, defend each other from the dangers that stalk young nomadic males, which are considerable. Older territorial males will kill you if you wander into their land. Hyenas, which might think twice about challenging a pride, will absolutely mob and kill a lone young male. And then there are the unglamorous killers: starvation, dehydration, infected wounds, the quiet, steady grinding of a world that offers you nothing for free. Having brothers means having backup. It means increasing your odds. Kapanga had that for about 8 months. The first signs of the fracture were subtle. Researchers tracking the 3 males noted behavioral shifts in the other 2, the larger pair, during the dry season that followed their expulsion. Food was scarce. They were moving through territory that belonged to other males, which meant constant stress, constant vigilance. The easy camaraderie of their cub days was under pressure from every direction. When food is scarce, the smallest male in a coalition suffers the most. Kapanga was being pushed off kills again, just like before, just like always. But this time there was no mother to keep the peace, no larger structure of pride dynamics to impose some rough order. It was just 3 young males in an indifferent landscape, and the calculus was shifting. The other 2 males began to move differently, sleeping slightly apart from Kapanga, moving ahead of him on travel routes, taking the choicest positions at kills and actively displacing him. These are not small things in the world of lions. These are signals, a language written in behavior and proximity, and the message was becoming clear. Kapanga was being edged out. By the end of the 8th month, the researchers watching this coalition began to note something alarming in their field journals. The 2 larger males were actively excluding Kapanga from feeding, not just occasionally but consistently. They were moving as a pair, not a trio. When they rested, he rested separately, sometimes by hundreds of meters. And then came the night that changed everything. The 3 males had been tracking a wildebeest herd that had moved through the area following rain. It was one of those nights that the savannah sometimes offers, moonlit, vast, alive with the smell of wet grass and distant movement. The kind of night that should have meant good hunting, a shared meal, a brief return to ease. Instead, it became the site of a betrayal that fieldworkers who documented it would later describe as one of the most remarkable and disturbing things they had witnessed in years of studying lions. Exactly what triggered it, no one can say with certainty. Perhaps it was competition over a female they had scented. Perhaps it was an accumulation of smaller tensions that had reached a breaking point. Perhaps it was simply the cold arithmetic of survival. 2 males deciding that a coalition of 2 was cleaner, simpler, and more survivable than one of 3 when one of the 3 was the smallest. Whatever the cause, the 2 larger males turned on Kapanga. He was attacked by both of them simultaneously. He fought back because that is what lions do, that is what Kapanga specifically had learned to do through years of being the underdog. But 2 against 1, and these were not strangers. These were his brothers who knew his fighting style, who knew how he moved, who had roughhoused with him since they were cubs, and therefore understood, better than any stranger could, where his vulnerabilities were. The attack lasted several minutes. By the time it was over, Kapanga had deep lacerations across his right flank and hindquarters. One of his ears had been badly torn, he had bite wounds on the back of his neck, he was bleeding from multiple sites. And his brothers walked away and left him there. They did not look back. The researchers in the field vehicle had observed all of this. They debated, as researchers always must, the ethics of intervention. The protocol in most long-term wildlife studies is non-intervention. You are there to document, not to alter the course of events you are studying. It is a brutal policy born from hard experience and scientific principle, but it is an agonizing one when you are sitting in a vehicle watching an injured young lion lying alone in the dark, bleeding into the grass. One of the researchers later wrote in her personal notes, not the field journal, the personal notes, that she sat in the vehicle for a long time after the other 2 males had gone, watching Kapanga through the night vision scope. He was breathing, he was alive, but he had not moved. And she wrote, I kept thinking he was going to get up, I kept waiting for it, he just lay there in the grass, and I thought, this is probably where it ends for him. It did not end there. It did not end there. In the days that followed, Kapanga did something that should not have been possible. He survived. He was not moving quickly. He could not. The wounds on his flank and hindquarters had stiffened, and there were signs of early infection, a swelling and weeping quality to the deeper lacerations that told a worrying story. He was moving slowly, drinking at any water source he could reach and eating whatever he could find, which at this stage meant small prey, rodents, birds, a monitor lizard. Humbling food for a lion, survival food. The field team tracked him intermittently during this period, maintaining their distance, not interfering, documenting. What they saw over the course of the next 6 weeks was a recovery that defied straightforward explanation. The wounds began to close. Lions have a remarkable capacity for healing, particularly when they can rest and avoid further injury, and Kapanga, for perhaps the first time in his life, was moving through the landscape entirely at his own pace with no brothers pushing him, no competition for resources, no social hierarchy bearing down on him. He was alone, completely alone, and he was slowly and painfully getting better. But being better physically was only part of the equation. A lone male lion in the African wild faces odds that are almost impossible to overstate. Without a coalition, you cannot hold territory. Without territory, you cannot attract females. Without females, there is no future. A lone lion is essentially a dead lion on a delayed timeline, making do in the margins of other males' domains, sneaking kills, avoiding confrontation, existing but not living. Many lions in Kapanga's position simply do not make it. They die of starvation, or they stumble into the wrong territory at the wrong time and are killed by resident males, or the accumulated stress and injury of the nomadic life simply grinds them down until there is nothing left. Kapanga did not do any of these things. What Kapanga did in the months that followed his abandonment and recovery was something that field researchers found genuinely unusual to document. Rather than attempting to find another coalition, rather than desperately seeking out other nomadic males to team up with, which is the standard strategy, Kapanga moved differently. He went deep into marginal territory, areas between established lion territories, the buffer zones and no man's lands that resident prides avoid because they are simply not worth holding. Sparse in prey, difficult to traverse, lacking the water sources and shelter that make good lion country. But for a lone injured male trying to survive without attracting the attention of resident males, these marginal zones were something else. They were, in a word, safe. Kapanga disappeared into these margins and spent the next year building himself. The field team lost track of him for stretches during this period. He was not in their regular study area. The data from this time is patchy, reconstructed later from occasional sightings, tracks, and a single camera trap image taken 7 months after his abandonment that showed him alive and moving through a rocky kopje area about 40 kilometers from where he had last been documented. He was thin in that camera trap image, visibly thin. His mane was patchy, not the full dark mane of a healthy adult male. His ribs were not showing dramatically, but the leanness of his condition was evident even in a still image from a remote sensor. But he was moving well. The camera trap caught him mid-stride, head up, ears forward, alert, purposeful. He was alive, and he was moving like he knew where he was going. In the 18 months after his abandonment, what was Kapanga doing out there? The honest answer is that the researchers cannot say with complete certainty because the documentation is incomplete. But what the evidence suggests, pieced together from later observations and from what they knew of his behavior even as a cub, is that he was doing exactly what he had always done. He was watching, he was learning, he was waiting. He would have been studying the movements of the territorial males in the surrounding areas, learning their patrol routes, their timing, their weaknesses. He would have been building his physical condition, becoming a better hunter because he had no choice, because every meal now depended entirely on his own skill and no one else's. A lone lion hunting alone in difficult terrain develops a set of capabilities that coalition males, who can rely on cooperative hunting strategies, often never fully develop. He had to be quicker, more precise, more patient. And he was growing. Male lions continue to develop physically until they are approximately 5 to 6 years old. When Kapanga was abandoned, he was roughly 2.5. He still had years of physical development ahead of him. Those 2.5 years of comparative hardship had not stunted him. If anything, the field team would later hypothesize they had driven his development in a particular direction. He had put on muscle in a way that purely coalition males often do not, because he had been relying on his own body completely, hunting alone, covering vast distances, surviving on insufficient food, and then overcompensating when prey was available. When the field team finally relocated Kapanga definitively, it was approximately 2 years after his abandonment. And when they found him, they almost did not recognize him. He had grown into one of the largest males they had ever documented in this study area. Not just large, powerfully built. His mane had come in dark, almost black at the center, the coloring that research suggests is associated with high testosterone levels and overall physical condition. He moved with a quality that the lead researcher later described in her notes as something I can only call intention. Every stride looked like it was going somewhere, like he had already decided what was going to happen next. He was 4.5 years old, he was alone, and he was beginning to move back toward the territories he had been expelled from. Now here is where you need to understand something about how lion territorial dynamics actually work, because this is the machinery that Kapanga was about to walk back into. A territory is only as stable as the males who hold it. The two ruling males who had expelled Kapanga and his brothers had been holding their territory for 4 years before that expulsion. By the time Kapanga was beginning his return, those males were now 8 or 9 years old, which in lion terms means they were on the wrong side of their prime. They were still large, still experienced, still dangerous, but the slow erosion of age was doing its work. Injuries healed more slowly. Stamina was not what it had been. The nightly patrols of a large territory were taking more out of them than they once had. And Kapanga's brothers, the two males who had abandoned him, who had turned on him and left him bleeding in the grass. They had established themselves as a coalition. They had for a time done reasonably well. They had claimed a small portion of a border territory, living at the edge of the study area in a zone that other researchers were monitoring but less intensively. They were holding a modest territory, had some access to females, and from all appearances were doing what young coalition males are supposed to do. But here is the thing that the savannah never lets you forget: nothing holds forever. Territorial battles had taken a toll on both of them. One had lost significant weight during a period of drought that hit the area hard. The other had suffered an injury to his left forepaw during a buffalo hunt that had not healed cleanly. They were still together, still a coalition, but they were managing a territory at the margins and doing so with diminishing physical resources. And then, over a period of approximately 6 months, the field team began to notice signs of a new presence. Tracks, scent markings, the evidence of a single large male who was moving through the area with a purposeful, systematic quality, not the panicked, darting movement of a lion who has wandered into another male's territory by accident and is trying to get out. This was a lion who was moving deliberately through the landscape, taking stock, making a map. The field team set additional camera traps. The first clear image they got, a night vision shot of a large, dark-maned male pausing at a prominent tree that served as a major scent marking post for the resident males, made the lead researcher sit very still for a long moment before she said anything to her colleague. It was Kapanga. And he was doing something that made the hair stand up on the back of her neck. He was not marking over the resident scent. He was not trying to assert his presence loudly and immediately. He was standing at the marking post, head low, reading the chemical information stored there with the thoroughness of someone studying a map before a long journey. He was gathering intelligence. Over the next 3 months, Kapanga's movements formed a pattern that the research team tracked with growing fascination. He was systematically surveying not one but both territories he would eventually need to challenge: the older ruling male's territory and his brother's territory. He was learning where the patrols were weakest, where the boundaries were maintained less rigorously, where the resident males were and when. He was not rushing. Let that sit for a moment. This was a lion who had every reason for revenge, if we can use that word, every reason to come blazing back in with fury and desperation. He had been left for dead. He had spent years rebuilding himself in conditions that would have killed most lions. He could have charged in swinging. He waited, he watched, he planned. The first challenge came against his brothers. The field team had not predicted the exact timing, but when it happened, they were fortunately in position to observe it from a distance. It was early morning. The light was that thin gold color that happens just after sunrise on the savannah when everything casts long shadows and the air still has the last of the night's cool. One of Kapanga's brothers was alone, the other having moved to a different part of their territory. Kapanga had tracked him for several days and knew his routine. He came in from downwind. He was close, very close, before his brother realized he was there. And when the recognition happened, when the two lions locked eyes after more than 2 years apart, there was a moment that the researcher watching through her binoculars would later describe as one of the strangest things she had ever witnessed in the field. His brother froze. Not the freeze of surprise, or not only that, something else. Almost, she wrote, like recognition was doing something more than just identifying. Like the sight of Kapanga, this large, dark-maned, fully developed male who should by all rights have been dead was processing on some deeper level. And then his brother turned and ran. Kapanga pursued him for approximately 2 kilometers before breaking off. He did not kill him, he had made his point. He was here, he was this, and now his brother knew it. The second brother was a different confrontation, more direct, more physical. This one did not run. He stood his ground and there was a fight, a real one, not the kind of ritual display and posturing that often resolves lion territorial disputes without serious injury. This was a fight between two males who had history with each other, who had known each other since before they could roar. It lasted nearly 8 minutes. 8 minutes is a very long time for a fight between large predators. By the end of it, Kapanga's second brother was on the ground, badly beaten, and Kapanga was standing over him with blood on his mane and his sides heaving. He let him live. Again. Later, when the researchers were trying to make sense of this, one of them pointed out that letting defeated rivals live is not uncommon in lion conflicts. That killing another large male is energetically costly and physically risky even for the winner. That there can be strategic reasons for letting a defeated rival go. That we should not overread these moments. Her colleague, who had been watching Kapanga for years by this point, said nothing for a moment and then said, "I know all of that. I'm just telling you what it looked like." What it looked like was that Kapanga remembered. Within 2 weeks of defeating his brothers, Kapanga had claimed their territory as his own. It was not the largest territory in the area, but it was his. He marked it, patrolled it, and the field team watched as the subtle shift happened, the way a landscape changes when a new lion moves in and starts to own it. But he was not finished. The older ruling males, the ones who had originally expelled him and his brothers from the pride, were still holding the main territory, and it was a better territory. Richer in prey, better watered, with the copy outcroppings and tree lines that make for excellent lion habitat. They were still a coalition, still 2 males, which under normal circumstances represents a significant advantage over a single male. But normal circumstances would have assumed that the single male was not Kapanga. He did not rush this one either. He spent 3 months establishing himself in his brother's former territory, consolidating it, and during this time he was doing something else that the research team watched with fascination. He was making contact with the females. Not the females from the main pride, not yet, but at the edges in the border zones there were females who moved between territories or who lived in the marginal areas. He was encountering them and they were not running from him, not consistently. He was developing a presence, a social reality on the landscape that went beyond just the physical territory he was holding. He was becoming known. And when he finally moved against the older ruling males, he had something that pure physical strength alone could not have given him. He had a reputation. The challenge to the older males came in stages, which is actually common in serious territorial disputes. There is rarely one decisive confrontation. There are a series of encounters over days or weeks, each one probing and testing, each one shifting the balance slightly until the final resolution. The first encounter was at a boundary mark. Kapanga approached openly in daylight, which is unusual and therefore immediately communicative. He was not sneaking, he was not uncertain. He walked to the boundary and he roared, and the research team documented that it was among the loudest, most sustained roaring bouts they had ever recorded in this study. He was announcing himself. The older males responded. They came to the boundary. There was a standoff that lasted most of an afternoon, a charged, crackling atmospheric standoff where 3 very large lions circled and postured and roared at each other in that low, chest-deep way that seems to rearrange the air itself. And then the older males withdrew. Not far, not permanently, but they withdrew, and Kapanga did not pursue. He had read the situation correctly. They were not ready to break, but they were feeling him, and he was not in a hurry. The decisive confrontation happened 11 days later. The older males had been doing what aging dominant males under pressure will do, moving together constantly, patrolling more, vocalizing more. There is a quality to stressed territorial males that experienced field researchers can read, a kind of heightened, almost frantic quality to their marking and roaring, as though they can sense something coming and are trying to hold it back with noise. It came on a dry season evening when the sun was going down and the shadows were long. Kapanga did not charge in, he walked in, That is the word the researcher used in her notes, and she underlined it. He walked in like he was arriving at something that was already his. The fight was recorded on video, and it has been analyzed many times since in wildlife research contexts because what it shows is genuinely remarkable. Kapanga fought both older males simultaneously, which is extraordinary for a single lion. He moved with a tactical intelligence that seemed to confuse his opponents. He would engage one, draw the other into an approach, and then shift, forcing the second one to check himself to avoid getting in front of the first one's charge. He had been watching these two work together for months. He knew how they coordinated. He knew that their coordination depended on the other male being where he was expected to be, and he knew how to disrupt that. It took 45 minutes. 45 minutes of one of the most intense territorial fights documented in recent wildlife research on this population. By the end of it, both older males had fled the territory. One was limping severely. The other had a wound on his shoulder that the field team, watching them the following morning, estimated would take weeks to heal. Kapanga stood in the center of the territory that had once expelled him, the territory where his brothers had been raised, where his mother had nursed him, where two powerful males had once looked at him and seen nothing worth keeping, and he roared. The sound rolled across 30 kilometers of savanna. The females of the pride, the same pride that had once been his family, heard it. And they came to him. This is the part of lion society that often gets lost in the drama of territorial battles, the part that makes the whole story make sense in terms of biology and evolution and the deep logic of how these animals structure their world. When a new male takes over a territory, the females do not simply vanish or resist entirely. They assess. The females of a lion pride are its continuity, its constant. Males come and males go, but the female lineages of a pride can persist for generations in the same territory. They have their own calculations to make, their own interests to weigh. What they saw when Kapanga took over was a male in his full prime. Large, dark-maned, clearly in exceptional physical condition given what he had survived and what he had just demonstrated. And he was familiar. Not in a threatening way, not in the way that an unknown outsider can be disturbing to an established pride, but in the particular way that something from your own history can be familiar, even if the relationship is complicated. He had been one of theirs once. He had been expelled, yes, he had come back, and he had won. Within a month of taking control of the territory, Kapanga had established himself as the sole ruling male of a pride that was now 22 lions strong. He was, by every measure that lion society uses to calculate these things, completely dominant. The field team watched all of this unfold with the particular quality of awe that comes from having the data and therefore understanding, in a way that pure observation cannot give you, the full arc of what they were seeing. This was a male they had watched tumble around in the grass as a cub. They had watched him get pushed off kills by his brothers. They had watched him get expelled, beaten, and left for dead. They had watched him lie bleeding in the grass in the dark, alone, with the researcher writing in her personal notes that she thought it was probably the end. And now they were watching him roar from the center of a territory that was his, completely and indisputably his, surrounded by females who had accepted him, in a landscape that had tried to kill him approximately 100 different times. He was not yet 5 years old. What follows in the years after Kapanga takes control is, in some ways, the most remarkable chapter of all because the story of a dramatic takeover is one thing. What you do with that territory once you have it is another thing entirely. Many males who come to power through exceptional individual effort or unusual circumstances struggle to maintain what they have won. The physics of lion society are relentless. You might win a territory alone, but holding it alone, against the constant pressure of younger coalition males who are coming up through the ranks, is enormously difficult. The conventional wisdom in lion research is that a single male, no matter how capable, is at a structural disadvantage compared to a coalition of 2 or 3. Kapanga did not read the conventional wisdom. What he did in the years after his takeover was expand, not recklessly, not all at once, but steadily. He pushed his boundaries outward into adjacent territories that were held by older or weaker males. He won confrontation after confrontation not through brute force alone, though his physical capability was genuinely exceptional, but through the same combination of intelligence, patience, and tactical reading of situations that had kept him alive through everything he had survived. The field team documented his patrol patterns during this period and found them unlike those of any other resident male they had studied. He varied his routes systematically. He marked not just the obvious boundary posts that every territorial male marks, but secondary and tertiary positions deeper in the territory and in the buffer zones around it, creating a layered impression of presence that made his territory feel, to potential challengers assessing it through scent and sound, more intensely occupied than a single male's territory might normally seem. He was managing his territory like a problem to be solved rather than just a resource to be defended. And he had cubs. The cubs came in the second year of his rule, and they came in numbers. 3 litters from 3 different females in the same season, which speaks to the health and social stability of the pride under his tenure. 7 cubs in total survived their first months, an excellent figure for a lion population in this environment. The researchers watched him with these cubs with particular interest because this is another area where male lions vary considerably in behavior. Some territorial males are largely indifferent to cubs, present but not engaged. Others are actively involved.